Hello, this is a 60-minute audiovisual presentation for Analyzing Language. Still thinking about written language or written discourse, the specific focus in this session is multimodal analysis, with a particular focus on the analysis of visual discourse in written or printed text using a method called social semiotics. As you work your way through the presentation, you'll need to have ready your own one-page print advertisement selected from a magazine or a newspaper, something with a fairly conventional format, in other words, not a grocery store brochure, and something depicting people or some sort of action. Generally speaking, the goal with multimodal analysis is to consider what happens when language scholars look beyond words, or rather besides words, not necessarily ignoring words, but thinking about other modes of communication which work together alongside verbal communication. There is, for example, a long-standing tradition of scholarship known as nonverbal communication. For this session, however, I'm orienting to an approach known as multimodality or multimodal discourse analysis. This is a wide-ranging field of study, so for today's session, I'm going to narrow things down by offering you some tools for analyzing print images, and this will help you examine the way verbal and visual communication almost always work together in communication. So let me say a few more sort of key points about the notion of multimodality. If you think about the kind of communication that happens around you every day, you already know that communication always works across several different modes or channels. No communication, written or spoken, is really ever simply linguistic. In fact, nowadays especially, we live in an age of what some have called design intensity, especially when it comes to interactive media such as advertising and of course online media, and most especially social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and so on, where the images, the visual content, are often as powerful, if not more powerful, than the verbal content. So while language is clearly hugely important, and it's one of our most sophisticated modes or channels for expressing complex abstract ideas, it only ever works in conjunction with other modes of communication. Hence, multimodality, multiple modes of communication happening together at one time. As I say, sometimes the words are more important for meaning, at other times less important. What's really interesting is that sometimes the words and the images in a text are not necessarily saying quite the same thing. And in this case, multimodality helps us identify contradictory messaging across different modes. Often visual content supports or illuminates the written content, at other times not so much. Well, it's for this reason precisely, in an age of design intensity, that language scholars have increasingly turned to addressing multimodality in their analyses. In order to analyze and understand contemporary written discourse, it behoves us to examine some of the other modes at work, such as visual images, but also color, space, and typography. And speaking of typography, in just a moment, I'd like to invite you to pause this presentation and play a little game. The game is simply this: how many of these 26 local Swiss and Bern brands do you recognize from their typefaces alone? So pause and see. The point I want to make here is a simple one. Without seeing the whole words, and based only on color sometimes, you're able to recognize the brands simply because of their typeface. As an aside, there is a technical difference between the terms typeface and font. Typeface is about the style of the lettering, and font is about the size and the weight of the lettering. And this is part of the problem when it comes to multimodality. We are often really good at describing in technical ways how language works. We've been taught grammar, for example, from an early age. But what we are much less good at, much less well trained at doing, is describing other modes of communication in similarly technical terms. Well, this session is partly about changing this when it comes to visual analysis. As you will have already heard, while moving through everyday spaces, we're constantly engaging with what some language scholars call linguistic landscapes. This is another subfield of sociolinguistic and discourse analytic research, which examines the intersection between space and words, or words and space. Language, of course, is hugely important in terms of structuring and organizing spaces, labeling spaces, telling us what kind of spaces we're in and how we're supposed to interact with the space and engage within the space. Well, by the same token, of course, words are only ever really made meaningful through their emplacement. Yeah? We often don't really understand what words mean and what they're doing in a sort of social or cultural sense without looking at where the words are in the world. Think, for example, from this montage about the word exit and entrance, words which only really make sense because of where they are actually placed. In other words, next to a doorway. What's noticeable about linguistic landscapes is that the kind of language being examined is not spoken or oral, it's written and visual, and so it's inherently multimodal. So we're back to the branded typefaces again. The words only work in conjunction with typeface, color, and of course location. In other words, space and place. The intersection between words and spaces is important for all sorts of cultural reasons. But linguistic landscapes can also be controversial and political, especially when it comes to the multilingual struggles played out between different languages. Take a look at these examples from the Flemish-speaking regions of Belgium on the left and from Durban in South Africa on the right. In the Belgian case, we have people protesting about the use of French on street signs. In South Africa, meanwhile, after apartheid, the names of towns, regions, streets were changed in an effort to replace references to colonial or apartheid-era figures to ones which better represented the history of people of color. In the case of Durban, which is where I grew up, many white residents found this change not only inconvenient, they also resented what they saw as unnecessary political sort of interference. Some people chose to express their dissatisfaction by speaking back, and in this case by writing back or spraying back. In other words, they were protesting the linguistic landscape by marking it again. Ultimately, the key issue is not simply about language per se, but about the way language is displayed in particular spaces. In other words, it's not just about the words themselves, but about their visual representation and their spatial emplacement. As such, then, it's all about multimodality. Analyzing images, the mechanics of looking, and visual semiotics. As a way to start training you with some multimodal analysis skills, I've decided to focus on visual communication, on the analysis of images in particular, just as a starting point. Remember what I said a moment ago, the key challenge in multimodal analysis is that most of us have spent a lifetime thinking about the way language works, but we're often much less good at other modes of communication. And to be clear, this is not simply a matter of academic or scientific interest. Being able to understand how something like visual communication works is a core life skill, and especially nowadays. Living as we do in an age of design intensity, we need to know as citizens how visual communication works in order to interpret, understand, and maybe challenge or even resist some of the ways that it's being used around us. And it's often used very persuasively to make us think in particular ways, or especially to buy particular things. So with this in mind, and as the main objective of our session, I'm going to be introducing you to a particular approach to multimodal analysis known as social semiotics. This is an approach developed and often used for analyzing images. But before we get to social semiotics, I want to think for a moment about the mechanics of looking and start with some foundational visual semiotics. In practice, visual communication works very differently from verbal communication. When we process written words, we typically follow, and have been trained to follow, a form of linear processing called a reading path. In English and other European languages, this entails reading from left to right and then top to bottom, processing word by word, sentence by sentence, and paragraph by paragraph. The mechanics of looking, however, function quite differently. Rather than a linear temporal processing, looking entails a more scattered spatial kind of processing. And this is what you will have done without thinking the second that you saw this painting. Thanks to eye tracking technologies, we're better able to know how people process images, and it looks something like this. Upon seeing an image, and within nanoseconds, we have scanned the image, but not completely randomly, and certainly not everything. We're not attending to everything to the same extent. We're certainly not reading the image from left to right and top to bottom in a slightly robotic way. What eye tracking technology produces, as in the example on the right here, is evidence for the way we seek out key information in the image. Typically, we focus on faces, if there are people, and then actions and interactions. And you can see this with the heavily overlaid markings here, which depict the way a person's eye settled for longer on a particular part of the picture or returned repeatedly to the same part of a picture. And in this case, you can see how the viewer pays special attention to the faces, trying to figure out who are these people, and then also to how they're interacting together. And as nonverbal communication scholars know, the face, especially the eyes and the mouth, is a key resource for expressing and interpreting people's emotional states. And so in this sense, people have a tendency towards processing social information first and foremost. And just as we attend to interactions, we're also very attentive to actions, hence the busyness around the man's foot walking, his raised left foot, and the entrance space where the maid is standing, holding open or closing the door. Something has just happened. What is it? Well, understanding the mechanics of looking, the physiology and the psychology of visual communication, if you like, has huge implications for the way images are designed to persuade us. Remember, as I suggested just a moment ago, visual communication is a life skill. And this is especially true when it comes to advertising. Advertisers leave nothing to chance. They want to know exactly where we will be looking, where we'll be focusing and spending our sort of cognitive energies when processing, for example, an advertisement like this one for Dolce & Gabbana. Of course, they're hoping we'll be struck by the presence of the Hollywood celebrity Scarlett Johansson. And eye tracking technology confirms not least because faces are so important to us. And in this case, the eye tracking is depicted in a slightly different kind of heat map device. It's a technique to show again, though, where the eye settles and where it keeps returning. What we see here, though, is so much attention is placed on the actor's face. It's all about Scarlett Johansson in this case. But thankfully for the advertisers, viewers also seek out the bottle. And as such, there's an association drawn between her and the perfume, which seems to have been made quite successfully. As you're going to learn in just a moment, this is what we call a vector, the line, the imaginary line established between the face and the bottle or the product. And these kind of language processing habits of kind of reading from left to right are not completely irrelevant, but they're only partially relevant to the way that we process an image. The most important thing is that advertisers spend a lot of time, a lot of money and technology testing how images work. In this other very well-known example, we see a similar kind of processing link between the face and other information in the image. Yeah? But in this case, there seems to be a lot more attention paid to the slogan, to the words. And we do have an inclination to kind of look at words. We know that words carry often key information. And especially in this case, words have been placed in the top left-hand corner, which is habitually where we often start doing our verbal processing. But what advertisers are able to do is to adjust the image in order to control the processing, and they do this by relying on a little bit of visual design. In other words, what they've done here is they've changed the model's gaze, the direction in which she's looking. Instead of looking at the camera and towards us, the viewers, she's looking towards the bottle. So while there's still a lot of attention paid to the verbal message, what's happening here is again about our inclination to look at a face and to follow the direction of people's gaze. We want to know what they are looking at because it's a kind of action or interaction. As I say, in social semiotics, we call this a vector, but I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Let me just summarize 3 things at this point. I want to just call your attention to the way visual communication works differently from verbal communication, how these 2 things, the verbal and the visual, are often interacting and influencing each other, but also how visual images are designed to control you, to make you look in particular ways. So still thinking about the mechanics of looking, although in a slightly more or less technological and sort of physiological way, I want to introduce you briefly to visual semiotics as a foundational approach to the analysis of visual images. This is a classic approach to social semiotics, or a kind of foundational approach, which is where, of course, we're going to be headed next. Visual semiotics is famously associated with the US-American tradition of semiotics and also the European-French tradition of semiology. In this second regard, the work of Roland Barthes has been enormously influential. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I want to give you the core principle of visual semiotics by way of Roland Barthes' famous analysis of this pasta advertisement. It's in an essay he published in 1964 titled the Rhétorique de l'image, or the rhetoric of the image. You should already have started working with visual semiotics in your homework exercise, of course, looking for signs and connotations in advertisement. So let me just situate that homework assignment a little bit further. For Roland Barthes, the visual communication, much like verbal communication, can be analyzed according to 3 orders of meaning. These are kind of 3 layers of interpretation. And the first order of meaning is the denotation, and this relies on the common sense description of what we see. In this case, for example, we see packets of pasta, a tomato, the head of a mushroom, a netted shopping bag containing some onions and peppers, all of which is set in front of a red background. And these objects and colors we can think of as different signs. The second order meanings concern connotations, all sorts of ideas and feelings that we associate with these different signs. So, for example, we might associate the tomato and the mushroom with fresh produce, simple cooking ingredients, home cooking even. The color red, especially for Italians, could be associated with the national flag, and especially when we put that alongside the green labels in the pasta packaging. And the red background also connects with the red tomato, both of which are often associated with warmth, vibrancy, and also tastiness. In many ways, though, it's the third order of meaning which is most interesting, the myths which lie beneath the surface. Myths here are not falsehoods, but rather shared cultural associations and narratives. And for Barth, this advert was a perfect example of Italianicity, of Italianness, steeped in notions of tradition and appreciation for simple, unpretentious cooking and so on. Well, the same basic visual semiotic analysis can be undertaken on just about any image, any advertisement, much like the one that you selected for your homework assignment, but also this other example here. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video for a moment and look at all the different signs that make up this complex multimodal text. The visual content, the typeface and font, the words, the colors, and so on. There is a lot going on in this text. The challenge, however, is not just to identify the denotations, all the different signs, but also their connotations and eventually the myths or cultural narratives which the text is drawing on. Let's have a closer look. To demonstrate just how much is going on in this text, let me pinpoint some of the numerous signs. But before I do that, I'd like you to quickly imagine what eye tracking technology might reveal. Most probably there's a lot of heat on the mouth and the ear, right? Because this is about faces and heads and also interactions. Of course, this all takes place in the middle of the image too, so that draws our attention to it. But let's go back to the signs for a moment. How many of these did you notice? What about the soft focus or the black frame? What connotational meanings do these sort of signs generate? There's, of course, the nose, the mouth, and the ear. What are we being encouraged to think here or feel here? There's the full red lips. Then there's the heavy cropping, which means we're not left with whole faces, but just a tight close-up of the ear, the mouth, and the nose. Why is it so heavily cropped? What meanings does this generate for us? By the same token, what meaning or meanings does the use of the italic font generate? What connotations? And what are the cultural stories that we associate with italics when it's like this? Of course, then there's the linguistic content and the sibilants in the words like whispering, smoothness, savor. What do these S sounds connote for you? What about the bluish coloring? Does this perhaps associate with the early morning or the late evening? And does this in turn help us imagine where these people are or what they might be doing? Then the ear again. We're surely being invited to think about some close contact here, something being whispered into someone's ear with all of the connotations of secrets and, of course, perhaps romantic intimacy. But there's more. There's the steam coming off the coffee, which presumably invites us to interpret this as a hot and thus freshly brewed cup of coffee. What other connotations or myths do we have of with thinking about steam, such as steamy or hot? Then there's the tag and the gold ribbon. The idea here is presumably that this coffee is so special that it's like a gift. And gold. Gold, of course, is full of connotations and mythology. There's also the style of the cup, not just any sort of old cup, and certainly not a mug. It's a cup and a saucer. This seems quite fancy or refined. Maybe this is coffee being drunk by refined, fancy people with good taste. And of course, related to that is the use of French in the slogan. This also brings all sorts of connotations and myths about culinary refinement and, of course, romance. But last but not least, a detail you might well have overlooked in your attempt to interpret who these people are, and especially the one with the full red lips, there's the stubble. How does this little sign change your interpretation? How does it inform your narrative? What I want is for this quick visual semiotic analysis to give you a really strong sense of how much is going on in your average image, especially in an advertisement. and how these complex visual texts can be really working in extraordinarily complex ways. You should also be left with no doubt about the multimodality of these texts. And lastly, I hope that this example gives you a sense of what else you might have been able to do with your homework exercise in your initial assignment. Speaking about your homework assignment, at this point in the presentation, as we turn towards social semiotics, you will need to have your advertisement in front of you. And you will also need the in-class assignment worksheet ready to complete while you're following the rest of the presentation. After each key concept or analytical tool that I'm going to be presenting, I need you to pause the video and apply the concept or the tool to your advertisement. Social semiotics, from images as representations to images as actions and interactions. So the kind of visual semiotics that I've just shown you is foundational and continues to be very foundational to the analysis of images and visual or multimodal text more generally. However, building on this classical semiotics and also arising from the analysis of language, social semiotics offers a more contemporary approach and a somewhat more elaborate way of analyzing visual and multimodal communication. In a nutshell, what social semiotics does is shift from thinking about images as only sort of passive representations to thinking about images as something more active, thinking about images as kinds of actions and interactions which do things in the world and which do things to people. And in this sense, social semiotics thinks about images much more in the way that eye tracking technology does. So along these lines, let me offer you just a few basic principles of social semiotics. Many of the core principles come from the work of Günter Kress and Theo van Leeuwen, and particularly their groundbreaking book published in 1996 called Reading Images, A Grammar of Visual Design. And in this book, as the title suggests, they offered a more detailed grammar of visual communication. They were interested not only in what's represented in images, but also concerned with many more subtle features. Ultimately, social semiotics treats images as being more active and interactive. As I say, not just these passive two-dimensional representations, but as practices which actively shape and organize everyday life and the way that we see the world. So images are understood as types of social action and social interaction. They make us think in certain ways, and they make us think about things in particular ways and on the basis of that to behave in particular ways. In other words, images actively do things to us. As such, social semiotics moves beyond simple sign-signifier relationships, the kind of stuff that you looked at in your homework assignment and we've just looked at a moment ago. They rather want to think about what they call meaning potentials. In other words, no sign has a single or fixed meaning that's necessarily the same for all people all of the time. Over time, and in particular cultural settings, signs do, however, become conventional and they do acquire potential meanings of some things and not other things. What really makes social semiotics more elaborate, and I would say personally more interesting, is it's grounded in the three primary or meta functions of all communication, whether it's language, images, or bodily interactions. In other words, all communication is organized around communicating or expressing or generating three particular types of meaning. First, there's representational meanings. In our case, how is the image representing the world in particular ways? And for this, we need to look at what's in the image, the visual content, if you like. In many ways, this is quite similar to the kind of classical semiotics we looked at a moment ago. But social semiotics wants to push us further because they're also interested in the kind of way that images and visual communication act in the world and interact with us. So in this regard, social semiotics is also concerned with compositional meanings. So not just what's in the image, but how the image is composed or arranged. Especially in the age of design intensity, we know that a huge amount of thought and money goes into designing images. Remember the eye tracking technology for testing the persuasive effect of advertisements. But there's even more meaning that's generated, according to social semioticians, that we also need to look at. And this is what's called interactional or interpersonal meanings. And here we're concerned with how the images engage us, how they make us feel. But also, when there are people in images, how we're invited to engage with those people or not. And it's this attention to the interpersonal function of communication that I think makes social semiotic analyses even more interesting and sophisticated. So let's take everything to the ground. And as I say, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be introducing you to some of the main analytical concepts or tools in social semiotics. 1 representational tool, 3 compositional tools, and 4 interpersonal tools. And at each point, as we go along in the in-class assignment, what you're required to do is pause the video and apply the concept to your advertisement. To be clear, not all of the concepts or tools will apply as easily or obviously to your particular advertisement. Either way, do your best and be sure to explain your decision, why it did or didn't apply. So let's get started. I turn first to representational meanings, and specifically the distinction between narrative and conceptual images, which has to do with what represented participants, people in the images, are doing. Let me explain the difference between narrative and conceptual images by way of the following examples drawn from a US-American newspaper front page analysis on a particular day and around a particular event. These were huge protests that happened for the first time. They've happened every year since almost, on the 1st of May 2006, and a series of protests all around the country called A Day Without Immigrants. And the details of the story are not so important for our current purposes, but just take a look at the following different types of images used on the front pages of newspapers to kind of depict and then sum up the events that were happening. And the first one is this rather conceptual image that I'm showing you here. This is an image which offers a general idea or a feeling rather than a detailed narrative. We have a single person, a child, wrapped in the US flag and staring slightly mournfully at the camera, which in other words means she's looking at us. Remember this point for later. From the image alone, however, we don't know who she is, we don't know exactly where she is, and in theory, from just the image, we don't know what she's doing. In other words, the image kind of presents depicts a sense of national pride, a concept of national pride. So compare this image with this one here. Here we've got multiple people, lots of people, which immediately starts to tell a bit more of a story about collective action. And as such, the image is just a little bit more narrative than the previous one. We also have some detail, even if it's from far below, about the setting. We've got a street, we've got trees, we've got buildings. In other words, we've got some context, and this makes it a little bit less conceptual and a bit more narrative. Now look at these two examples of what I would think of as even more narrative images, which tell even more of a story. Yeah, and most of the time it's because there's more detailed information given, more background detail, but also more interactional detail. Here we've got images of people actually doing things. I mean, even if the setting isn't particularly detailed or obvious, it's a little bit decontextualized, we still see signs of people interacting and doing things. There's something happening. There's a story unfolding. these people are in relationship. And in the case of the top image, it appears that they're even in conflict with each other. Here's an even bigger sample from the same data set, a study that I did with a number of other people where we were looking at how newspapers around the United States reported this event. And as you see, I've arranged the images. This is just a sort of careful selection, moving from conceptual on the left to more narrative images on the right. Yeah. And the difference between conceptual and narrative is not often an either or, but really a matter of degree. So I would suggest that, as I say, the images on the left tend to be more conceptual. And as you move across the right, we see images becoming more and more narrative in terms of the number of people, the amount of detailed setting, and the extent to which we see faces and people interacting with each other. And so when it comes to social semiotics and the representational meanings, we're thinking not just about who or what is in the image, but what's happening between them. So conceptual images tend to be quite vague and sentimental, often strategically designed to be non-specific or generic, expressing a general idea or feeling rather than anything too specific. And these kinds of images are often favored by advertisers who want precisely to appeal to as many different people as possible. And so too much detail actually kind of gets too specific and kind of gets in the way. And when it comes to newspaper reports, however, and other fact-driven discourse, one expects or hopes to see more narrative images, images with detail about the people, the setting, and the context. So at this point, this is all I want to say about representational meanings. Pause the video, take a look at your advertisement, and decide whether the main image in your advertisement is more conceptual or more narrative. And remember to explain why. As I say, social semiotics offers us a number of other ways to analyze images, thinking more carefully about the way they generate all sorts of different meanings. And this brings me to compositional meanings. And the first of the examples or the tools or concepts within compositional meanings is something called information value. And information value concerns the way different features of an image are distributed or arranged. In other words, how value or importance is assigned to different information in an image. According to Crescent van Leuven, the way we read images, is partly conventional. These are habits established over hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, images can be very subtly designed along the lines of the way written texts are produced and processed. In other words, from top to bottom and left to right. And from a very Western European perspective, for example, this Christian iconography offers some really interesting clues into the way over hundreds and hundreds of years we've been taught to read images and design images rather like we read and design written texts. So the information, say Crescent van Leuven, in a complex image like this can be distributed in often very patterned ways, according to what appears in the center and what appears in the margins, left and right, top or bottom. I mean, these are not hard and fast rules, but they are quite interestingly persistent conventions. So, for example, and following the design of the religious icon, like this one here, information in the center or in the middle is often where the image makers want us to focus. This is often where the most important information is located. And in images where there's plenty of different features, we also have this tendency, say Crescent van Leuven, to be seeing images according to what appears to be a sort of top, bottom, and a left-right arrangement. So as with heaven and earth, in the Christian icon, information appearing at the top of images may often kind of be encoded or valued as ideal, while information at the bottom is often encoded or kind of interpreted as real. And if you think about this in modern terms and the way advertisements often work, it's the product that very often appears at the top and all the small print about at the bottom. And a similar kind of valuing of the information can happen in the left-hand and right-hand side if an image has a distinct left and right, or top or bottom, that is. And again, this is partly because we're so trained to think about reading and writing from left to right, and in particular in Western cultures, of course. There's a tendency, therefore, to think of information on the left as old or given, yeah, and the past, if you like, and then information on the right as the new, the present, or perhaps even the future. And in the religious icon, for example, we find the birth of Jesus on the left and his crucifixion, his death, and his ascendancy to heaven on the right. So this given and new format is recognizable also often from advertising, particularly when advertisements want to use that before and after device. Take a look at this old example of a Maybelline makeup advertisement. And you've got the ordinary face, the one without the Maybelline makeup, on the left. And then thanks to the use of their products, you have this made up, supposedly more attractive face on the right. Here are another couple of examples. Weight loss advertisements almost always follow the same information value organization of what's before on the left and what's after on the right. In the second example here, something I picked up years ago in the United States for a tinned soup brand called Progresso. And again, the composition of the advertisement, this one's pulled from a newspaper, clearly uses the same information value technique to generate the meanings of old and new from left to right. And in this case, Campbell's, the competitor soup, is the old news. The new news is the stuff that's on the right, which is Progresso. Again, just to be clear, not all images have such a clear left-right design, in which case it might not be quite so obvious, the information value. But when there is a clear left-right or top-bottom or center margin kind of design, it's often encoded in this way. Take a look at some more examples at how information value is working in some other advertisements, something slightly more recent. In this first example, we have another very strong left-right composition, but this time information value is deliberately used to communicate the chronology of the timeline, if you like, of what happens if you smoke. The advertisers want to factor in the damage happening over time. In other words, the given or the past face is again on the left, but the new and the future face is on the right. It's quite a simple but very effective design. This relationship is played with nicely also in the following advertisement, which is clearly composed of two distinct parts on a left-right axis, and even explicitly labeled, in this case, in the top left-hand corner, as before and after, just in case we didn't understand. They're using words to make it clear. Here we have the company Philips promoting a razor designed for men. And in the past, or more likely the present, the given, as it were, we have a man with a hairy chest. And the message here is that straight men shave their chests. If they shave their chests, they'll end up with a lot of very different hair, a woman's long hair, or in fact two women's long hair, and that's the future on the right. Just note two things here about this image before we move on. The product detail appears at the bottom in the real sector of the image, leaving the images at the top to communicate the ideal. This is the information in these advertisements that they give the most value to. But also note how the visual meaning is clarified and it's tied down, or in Roland Barthes' terms, it's anchored with the words. The slogans also, not just the ones at the top, but the slogan in the white box reads, "Designed for men, appreciated by women." These two short sentences, the verbal content, therefore, mirrors the two-part structure of the visual content. The advertisers know that it's quite possible for men to have long hair. Remember those full red lips from the previous advertisement. So they felt the need to verbally clarify the point that this is meant to be women's hair. And I mention this because it's a neat example of multimodality working, how the visual and the verbal are working together to generate the meaning. So now pause the video and decide whether and how information value is working in your advertisement. Now for another compositional meaning or another compositional tool or concept. Framing is all about the way information, different features or parts of an image are connected or disconnected. And here's a neat example of where framing is very obvious. Again, not all images or complex visual text necessarily lend themselves to framing in such an obvious way as this one does. Now, information in an image can be connected or disconnected in a number of different ways. Frame lines, color or shape, empty spaces, or so-called vectors, these imaginary lines, especially the ones we follow with gaze. So I'd like to start by noting that this explicitly two-part image actually reverses information value conventions of the ideal at the top and the real at the bottom. And there's a good reason for this, which is confirmed by the strong frame line across the middle, which disconnects but also connects the information and helps explain the message and the meanings in this complex image. The frame line in the middle is clearly meant to be a search bar in a web browser. And as such, the top half is connected to the bottom half by searching for Starwood hotels, and then you can replace your drab, humdrum life with the warm, topical fantasy holiday on the bottom. So this message, the vision on the top and the vision on the bottom, is also communicated through other framing devices, most notably color and especially color contrast. The very gray image at the top is designed to be deliberately disconnected from the very colorful image on the bottom. It's another world that's being represented, and the contrasting color kind of helps create this distinction between ordinary life and luxury travel life. But we also have some other important vectors helping to connect or disconnect the information. Remember, vectors, as I indicated earlier, are these imaginary lines which draw our attention between some bits of information in an image and other bits, like the model gazing at the bottle. We have, in that case, the viewer's attention is drawn to the bottle because we're looking at where she's looking. And in this current example, we follow the woman's gaze in both the top half and the bottom half. At the top, the vector between her face, which we can't see, and the Hawaii poster directs our attention to the poster. We're encouraged to imagine her desiring or fantasizing about a beach holiday while standing in the rain on the street. And then next, we're invited to follow her gaze, another vector, by looking at the wonderful scenery in the image below. And of course, I would suggest that there's one more vector that's very important here in the way that the image has been composed and designed between the woman on the top and the woman on the bottom. And they're in very different places in the world, but within the image, they're located in exactly the same place. And this establishes the connection between them, which means that we're supposed to recognize that these two women are the same person. All this communication, all of this messaging is being accomplished partly by representational meanings, for example, the trench coat and the swimsuit, but also through these different compositional meanings, partly through the visual content, but partly through the way this content is organized and positioned in the image. So now pause the video and decide whether and how framing is working in your advertisement. The third compositional meaning, which I want to look at, is salience. This is all about the way images are designed in particular ways to make certain elements or specific signs, certain features, call attention to themselves. I'm going to start with a particularly striking example, and then I'll offer in the way of a little bit of a gender balance another example in just a moment. In various ways, this image has been designed carefully to make certain features, certain parts of the image stand out, to be more salient than other features or parts. Now, salience can be accomplished in several different ways, such as through size, color, contrast, especially light and dark, foregrounding or backgrounding, or symmetrical or asymmetrical placement. Well, in terms of placement, salience can work closely with information value, for example, the obvious centering of Selma Hayek's breasts in this case. But here the centering is enhanced, and in other words, her breasts are made even more salient through contrast, their whiteness, in other words, against the kind of darkness or blackness of the rest of the image. By the same token, the bottle, the product being promoted, is made salient through the use of color. In other words, its redness really stands out and is salient. It's a little difficult to see from this reproduction here, but the red is also picked up in Selma Hayek's necklace, which also looks like rubies. And so in this case, there's a nice vector drawn, what we could call a color rhyme, between her necklace and the product, the liquor. Speaking of vectors, the most striking vector here is established between the man's nose, his gaze, her breasts, and the bottle. It's deliberately unclear in this case whether he's looking at her breasts or the bottle, or probably both. And this, of course, is a long established idea in advertising that celebrities and sex sell. And here then we have both at work, and both working through representational meanings, Selma Hayek herself and her breasts, but also through compositional meanings. The sexiness of the message is designed into the way that the image is designed in terms of information values, frame lines, and salience. I said I'd offer another striking example. This is not a celebrity endorsement in quite the same way as the Campari advertisement, but the model here, David Gandy, is one of the world's most famous male models. And in this case, needless to say, the message doesn't rely on who he is so much as what he looks like and how he's positioned, and especially how he's positioned in relation to the product. It's Dolce & Gabbana's light blue cologne. The framing here is not subtle. The vector established between the bottle and his crotch, as well as through the use of the white, connects both of these pieces of information very clearly. Nor, for that matter, is salience subtle here. The information which calls attention to itself is partly done through the asymmetrical emplacement, partly through color and color contrast, and partly through foregrounding and backgrounding. In both these examples, a striking and hard to miss feature of their design is the fact that both Selma Hayek and David Gandy are looking directly at the camera, and this will be our next social semiotic concept or tool. But first, pause the video again and decide whether and how salience is working in your advertisement. We now turn to the third meta function of communication, the first type of meaning that's always generated in communication, whether it's verbal communication or visual communication. And in this case, it's interpersonal meanings. And here I've got 3 or 4 specific concepts or tools to consider. Remember, a core principle of social semiotics is that images actively engage and interact with us. This is especially the case when images depict people, in which case we are being invited often to interact with the people in the image or not, or in particular ways. In this regard, the first tool I want to talk about is contact. And this is established most obviously through the presence or absence of a direct gaze with the represented participants, the people represented in the image. Of course, the other important kind of participant are viewing participants, which is us, the viewers. And as such, what we're interested in here is the kind of social contact established between the represented participants and the viewing participants. From the previous examples, between you and Selma Hayek, or you and David Gandy. Social semioticians distinguish between two very different types of images when it comes to the kind of contact that is or isn't established. Here are two contrasting examples. On the left, we have a demand image. In other words, an image which is demanding in the sense of the represented participant, the man, is making direct contact with us through his gaze. He's looking straight at you, demanding your attention and some kind of reaction. Of course, in this case, it's also a close-up image, but I'll get to that in just a moment. On the right, meanwhile, we have an offer image with a represented participant, the woman, looking away from the camera. And this kind of image invites us to look at her in a somewhat more voyeuristic way, a kind of interaction that's also compounded by the fact that she's naked. In some sense, we might think about the man on the left as being more in control of the interaction with viewers than the woman is. He sees us, as it were. She doesn't even know that we are looking. When it comes to contact, images recreate and execute precisely the same kind of engagement we'd experience if we were actually in the same space with the people represented. One of the most famous examples of a demand image is this US-American military recruitment poster from 1941. Here, Uncle Sam, the mythological Uncle Sam, is looking directly at the viewer, and he's also pointing. This is a very explicit demand for engagement and a reaction or action on the part of the viewer. In a multimodal sense, this visual demand is underlined quite literally, also with verbal meanings generated through the capitalized you in the slogan. But contact can be established in different ways and also to different degrees. Take a look at some more men's perfume advertisements. These are actually advertisements which represent the changing representations of men and the kind of increasing sexualization of men in advertising from the 1990s to the 2000s and the 2010s. You can see very different kinds of masculinity being depicted and promoted here. And the sexualization is accomplished partly from the increasing use of nakedness and particular body postures. But also, I want you to note, it's also achieved through the increasing degrees of interpersonal meanings and the interpersonal demand. Once more, pause the video at this point and decide how and whether and how contact is working in your advertisement. Another interpersonal meaning and analytical tool is social distance, which is also related to the interpersonal meanings established through contact. This time, though, the interpersonal meaning is generated through the extent to which an image is a close-up or a long-distance shot. Take a look at these examples of stock photography from Getty Images. What social semioticians recognize and call attention to is that images are designed in ways that recreate the way that people interact with each other in everyday life, that is, in real, live, face-to-face communication. And these three images, clearly from the same photo shoot with using the same models, but what they do is through the extent to which the shot is cropped, the picture is cropped tighter and tighter, then this generates different degrees of intimacy depending on how close we are invited to imagine ourselves in relation to the models. Just as in real life, stepping closer and closer to someone in front of us, the less and less we see of their whole body. And as we retreat or step back, we see a whole body which positions us in a more sort of social or public kind of distance. In the bottom image, it's as if we were so close that we have our faces right in their faces. Taken to their extreme, advertisements like these use close-up shots deliberately or strategically for creating heightened senses of intimacy. If you stop for a moment to think about just how close you would have to be in real life to see people like this in this way, it all starts to feel rather awkward. For the man on the left, for example, it's as if you were in the shower with him, or at least standing in the doorway of the shower. By the same token, to see the woman on the right, you would have to be right on top of her. And this, of course, is exactly what the advertisers want you to feel, how they want you to interact with the represented participants. In other words, once again, sex sells. The point, of course, is simply to demonstrate how images are far from passive two-dimensional representations. Instead, they are actively doing things to us and with us, encouraging us to think in particular ways, but also obliging us to interact with represented participants in particular ways. Once again, pause the video and decide whether and how social distance is working in your advertisement. We're almost finished with the Social Semiotics Toolkit, and I want to end with camera angle, specifically the way this generates interpersonal meanings when it comes to vertical or horizontal angle. And I'll start with the first of these. When it comes to the relationships established between represented participants and viewing participants, vertical camera angle can alter status and power relationships. Depending on whether the camera is angled from above or below, viewing participants can be positioned as looking up or down at the represented participants, respectively. Take a look at these contrasting power differentials. On the left is a famous portrait of the former British Queen made by the famous American photographer Annie Leibovitz. Adding a little graphic helps. To indicate how viewers are positioned as looking up at the Queen, or rather her looking down on us, you need to imagine where the camera would be positioned in order to take this shot. And that's, of course, exactly what the photographer probably the Queen herself wanted. They want us to understand a significant status differential or power differential. On the right, however, you see how the power relationship is reversed. We are now positioned as viewers looking through the camera angle as to looking down on the child. It's worth noting here how the child's gaze also creates a demand image, the kind of demand in the image, intended, of course, to make the viewer feel engaged, but also, I imagine, responsible in some way. It's also worth noting across the two images how social distance is produced very differently. As expected, we're not asked to imagine ourselves being intimate with the Queen, so the shot is quite a broad shot. But there's a different expectation when it comes to us wanting us to feel closer to or more connected with the vulnerable child who needs our help. Ultimately, it's through all of these different interpersonal design effects that we have an image of a very powerful queen and a very powerless child. Before you pause the video to apply things to your advert, let me also consider horizontal angle. Horizontal angle helps create different images and different degrees of involvement depending on whether the viewers are positioned to be looking straight on at represented participants or looking at them sideways, either from the left or from the right. And once again, this creates different degrees of engagement or disengagement between the represented participants and the viewing participants. It's not easy to find good examples, but I've relied again on Getty Images and with the same kind of graphics to represent the position of the viewer thanks to the camera angle. So on the left, it's as if we were standing directly in front of the chef, close but not too close. And we're invited to feel quite involved with him and engaged with his work because we're looking directly at him and at what he's doing. In this image, we're also drawn to the vector created by his gaze, looking at what he's looking at, in other words, making the salad. On the right, meanwhile, we're positioned as looking at the chefs from the side. We're less involved with them and with the work that they're doing. And this is compounded by the fact that they're not even looking at us. Thus, this is an offer image. So for the last time, pause the video to consider whether and how camera angle, whether it's vertical or horizontal, is playing a part in your advertisement. Before I conclude, I want to just say something quickly about the required reading that's been assigned to accompany this presentation and to enhance your understanding by way of a case study demonstration. The reading in question is a paper published in the journal New Media and Society in 2020, which reports a study I conducted with 2 colleagues and some other research collaborators. In this study, we used a combination of content analysis and social semiotics to investigate the way global image banks produce a particular way of representing young people and their technology use. And I offer this montage of images which are typical of the ones we looked at, which constituted a much larger data set of 600 photos drawn from 3 of the world's large image banks. For the purpose of this introduction to multimodal analysis, it's worth noting that we generated and examined a data set also of keywords, in other words, the verbal communication, which is used by image banks to tag the photos. And we also looked at a number of newspaper reports which use both words and images to tell their stories. But for now, I just want to leave you with the social semiotic analysis of the photos. And it's this that's most relevant for you, and particularly in terms of representational meanings, compositional meanings, and interpersonal meanings. And these are all encapsulated rather nicely in the 3 examples here. I'm not going to go into detail because you can read the paper for yourself, but here are some of the features that we looked at in each of these different types of meanings in our analysis. These are the main findings or interpretations of the paper, which show how we connect small-scale design features in the images to skew both the ways technology and young people are depicted. So pause the video if you like to take note of this. But this now is the end of the presentation.